Some days, of course, I'll get tired. Some days I will get beat up. Some days I will get knocked down, and I will have some bad days. But I will not stop.
Good morning. For those of you who are sitting right here, I'm sorry our projector went out this morning, so we couldn't replace it. You notice Scott's looking pretty buff? We're doing a competition in our office right now. It's like a fitness competition, gain muscle, lose fat. Scott's killing us all. I don't know what that has to do with this message, but I'm failing. There you go. I'm failing the contest. Well, I want to start with a question. Have you ever been in a cave? Like, have you ever literally been in a cave? Our family went on vacation several years ago, and we went into the caves up by Murphy's. We descended in these caves about 15 stories. When we got to the lowest point in the cave, the guide was explaining how the original explorers explored with candlelight. And so at one point, he lit candles, and he had him on this hat, and he turned off the lights. And just so that we could feel what it would be like to explore these caves with candlelight. And then he blew out the candle so that we would experience complete darkness. Like, I've never been in complete darkness before. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Now, I can't ever remember feeling claustrophobic before, but all of a sudden, my mind was filled with all of these thoughts. Like, I can't get out of here. I'm trapped. Like, what if we don't get the lights back on? And I was having a panic attack. I could hardly breathe. Even after he turned on the lights, my mind was filled with all these thoughts and feelings that I did not want to have. Like, I didn't ask them to come, but they came. I hid them as best I could, but my mind just kept thinking, you're trapped. You can't get out of here. Like, you're going to pass out, and this guy's not going to be able to carry you out of here. And these were things in my mind that I did not want in my mind. I didn't say these things out loud, but I was trying to hide them, but they were there. So now here's the question. Did I believe I was safe in the cave? Like, I knew in my mind that thousands of people had toured these caves before and lived to tell about it. Well, I want to say part of me knew I was safe. I suppose if I had to answer a true or false question, I would say, yes, I was safe. But I'll tell you something. My sweat glands were producing a lot of sweat. Like, they didn't believe I was safe. My stomach had butterflies in attack formation. Apparently, my stomach didn't believe I was safe. My heart was beating faster than it normally does. My heart wasn't too sure about it. And then I turned to God in this moment, and I began to pray. I didn't do that immediately. Like, I'm a pastor, you would think that'd be something I would do immediately, but it wasn't. It was something that I thought of later. And so I prayed to God, and then God started giving me these promises from Scripture. And I started at that point to feel safe. My blood started flowing again, and my heart and my mind and my body began to calm down. Being in a cave was actually a painful experience for me, but I realized something. God taught me something in that cave. He shifted my perspective, and I began to feel safe. It wasn't the most enjoyable experience. I'm not going to plan a return visit to those caves anytime soon, but God taught me something in that cave that day. Well, today we're going to look at a time when David was in a cave. And this was a very painful and discouraging time in David's life where he experienced just one failure after another. But what we're going to learn today and each week throughout this series is failure is not final. But it's a step forward if we respond appropriately. God can and will use our failures if we allow him to. And he'll take us to places beyond what we ever thought were possible. All right, so let me tell you about a little bit about what's going on in David's life at this point. David had been anointed by Samuel, the prophet that was sent by God to select the new king for Israel. He's been employed by Saul, so the current king. He defeated Goliath, the great Philistine enemy of Israel, who mocked God. everything is looking up for David. Everyone loves him. People are singing songs about him. Everything he touches is turning to gold. He's on his way to the palace, and he's going to become the next king. Now, something happens, and one by one, all these great things are going to be stripped away. I don't know if you've ever experienced something like this, but David gets completely discouraged by the events of his life. One of the greatest problems people have with failure is they judge too quickly the isolated events of their lives, and they label them as failures. Let me just run through some of the events of David's life. First of all, his job. He was promoted from shepherd kid to court musician to warrior, and he ended up serving as one of the most successful officers in the army of Israel. But then one day, Saul became extremely jealous and started throwing spears at David, literally throwing spears at David, and David had to flee for his life. And so he lost his job, he lost his income, he lost his security. He went from being a warrior to being a fugitive, and he would never serve in the army again. Imagine experiencing a loss like that. Imagine the sense of failure that he must have felt. Next, he loses his wife. He was married to Saul's daughter, Michal, but then one day Saul sent his soldiers to David, to his home to kill David, and when Michal helped David escape, she was taken by Saul, and Saul eventually had her marry another man. And so David lost his job, and he lost his family. Imagine how he must have felt, just one failure after the next. He flees to the town called Ramah, where Samuel, his spiritual mentor, was. Samuel was the one who anointed David in the first place. Samuel was the one who assured David of God's presence in his life. Samuel is the one God spoke through to David. Samuel, he knew, would be a safe person. He would be a safe place. But no matter how far David ran, it wasn't far enough. And Saul heard about this. He sent soldiers to Ramah, and David had to make another escape. Now, Samuel was an old man at the time, so he couldn't go with him. And soon after that, Samuel dies. So David loses his job, David loses his family, and now David loses his mentor, the one who anointed him. He runs to his best friend. He runs to Jonathan, King Saul's son. Jonathan loved David more than he loved himself. This is probably the one person in the world that David knew to the core of his being he could trust with everything. Jonathan stood up to his own father, King Saul, and risked his life for David. But Jonathan could not leave the kingdom. Jonathan could not raise a sword against his own father. And so David had to run for his life once more. And now he's lost his best friend. So David has experienced vocational failure. He's experienced financial failure. He's experienced relational failure. And now we pick up the story in 1 Samuel 21, starting at verse 10. That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Now David has lost his country. He's lost his home, and he goes to Gath. Anyone know who came from Gath? It's a real tall guy. It'd be a great draft pick for the NBA. Yeah, Goliath. That's where Goliath was from. David was now, he has no place to go but to his mortal enemies, the Philistines. And look what happens. But the servant of Achish said to him, "Isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one who they sing and dance about? Like Saul has slain thousands, and David has tens of thousands." David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence, and while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. So this is like the first acting gig in Old Testament. Achish said to his servant, "Look at the man, he's insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house?" Now 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So this is a man who is expecting a palace. He's waiting for the day when he's going to take the throne. He had wealth and power and beauty and fame and friends and security, what he thought was a guaranteed future. And of course, it wasn't his idea in the first place. This was God's idea. And now all of that is gone. No money, no home, no friends, no job, no advisors. He's running for his life. He expected a palace, and he ends up in a cave with no explanation of why, and no guarantee of when it's going to ever be over. He ends up completely discouraged by the failure that his life has become. Discouragement is like a cancer of the soul. And really, who you are, like the test of your character, is not so much how you respond when things are going really well. It's how you respond when you've failed and you're in the valley of discouragement. You see, people who fail forward see these kinds of discouraging experiences in life just as a part of life. And they learn from them, and they grow from them, and they're able to get beyond them. And so today we're going to look at how David responded to this failure in his life. And we're going to look at a verse, we'll get to it in a moment, that describes an incredible spiritual skill that David had. And I hope all of us will develop this because it will serve us well. It'll serve us well when we end up in a cave. A cave is where we end up when everything that holds us up gets stripped away. A cave is where we end up when we thought we were going to do great things or have a great family, and now it's clear that things are not working out the way that we had dreamed. And I know some of you are probably in a cave right now. Maybe you're in financial trouble. Your financial life is failing, and you're in a cave. Maybe you're not in the job or the school of your dreams, and you're in that kind of a cave. Maybe you've lost a loved one to death or divorce, and it feels like your relationships are failing. Maybe you always dreamed of being married, and it hasn't happened, and you feel like a failure. Maybe you're married, and that's deeply disappointing to you, and you're in that kind of a cave. Maybe you've been deeply disappointed in a relationship with a parent or a friend or someone else, and you're in that cave. Maybe it involves a physical condition, a health failure. Maybe you made bad decisions somewhere along the line, and everything is just crashing down around you, and you just find yourself alone. For whatever reason, you're in a cave. You know, some of you may not be in a cave today, but you will be one day. No one plans on living there, but sooner or later, everyone spends some time in a cave. And what's hardest, I think, about being in a cave is you start to wonder, has God lost track of me? Has he forgotten his promises? Does he even remember where I am? Does he even hear me? Will I ever be anywhere but here in this cave? Will I die here? But there's one other thing that we need to know about caves, and that is caves are where God does some of his best work. A cave is where God sometimes molds us and shapes us like no place else. Sometimes when everything that holds us up gets stripped away and all we have in this world is God, that's when we discover God is enough. God is really enough. And all those props that we thought our lives were being held up by aren't supporting it. Sometimes of all the places in the world, it's not the palace, but it's the cave where we meet God. God does some of his best work in caves. Well, there's no real chronology in the text, but as best we can tell, David spends about 10 years of his life in the wilderness, on the run as a fugitive. From a human perspective, it looked like God's promises to him were never going to come true. And those are real hard years. Now, he wasn't entirely alone. He did have some people come to form a little community. They weren't the best group of people. Look at chapter 22, verse 2. This is David's little community. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their commander. About 400 men were with him. Those of you who are involved in a small group, how'd you like to have that be the description of the members of your group? All those who were in debt, distress, or discontented. Wouldn't that be a fun group to lead? Well, David spends years with these guys. Look at 1 Samuel 30 for a moment. This is still in the wilderness era of David's life. Cave to cave, eventually he and his men establish a kind of refugee community in the village of Ziklag. And by this time, they had all got married, they were raising their families. One day, they come home, and their village is gone. It had been burned, and their wives and sons and daughters have been taken captive. And these men, who are outlaws and fugitives from their own country, established this little refugee village, and now it's gone. 1 Samuel 30, verse 3. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters were taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. You ever cried like that? Like until your body is just so exhausted from crying. You're so sad that you don't even have strength left anymore. They wept until they had no strength left to weep. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? And for David, it's just about to get worse. Look at verse 6. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. Now again, just pause here for a moment before I read on. Here's David, a fugitive from his own country. His own king is trying to kill him. His mentor is dead. The Philistines don't trust him. His refugee village is gone. His best friend is gone. His ragged little community is ready to stone him. Now he has nowhere else to turn. And then comes, I think, one of the great statements in all of the Bible. Look at this at the end of verse 6. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Isn't that great? The King James translated, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. But David was encouraged in the Lord. He found strength in the Lord his God. Isn't it amazing to be around people that encourage you? Isn't it just amazing? Like I was with a couple this week, and they were talking to me about their marriage. They said 6 months ago they were going to get a divorce, and God completely turned around their marriage because they are here at Blue Oaks, and because they were listening to the teachings that I present, and it was like listening to them was just such an encouragement today. It just like lifted my spirits. Encouragement from people gives you life. But I want to tell you, when you're in a cave and there's no one around, you can be encouraged by God alone. You can find strength in the Lord your God. This is a great mystery of spiritual life. When every other resource was gone, every prop kicked out from under him, every crutch removed, David found strength in the Lord his God. Now, of course, this leads to a great question. Like, what do we do to find this kind of strength? Well, in the time that we have left, I want to look at 4 lessons that we can learn from David about how to fail forward, about how to find strength in the Lord our God during times of failure. 4 lessons from David on how to fail forward. We really can learn to find strength in the God of the universe. All right, so what does David do? First thing, if you want to be strengthened by God or in God, the first thing you must do is discuss your failure openly with God. You've got to name it. And this is going to actually take some time and effort. I want you to notice something in Psalm 142. Many of the Psalms are written by or associated with David. This is one of them. And some of the Psalms will have like a superscription above it. Psalm 142 says, a psalm of David when he was in the cave. So this psalm is for cave people. This apparently expresses the cry of David's heart when he was living in a cave. Look what he says. I cry out to the Lord. I plead for the Lord's mercy. I pour out my complaints before him and tell him all my troubles. Now, real quick show of hands on this one. How many of you can complain? Did you raise your hand? Like, how many of you have discovered it's actually a spiritual gift of yours? Well, if you can complain, you can do this step. David says, I pour out my complaints to God. It's real interesting. Old Testament scholars will tell you there are different kinds of psalms. Some of them are called thanksgiving psalms. Some of them are called enthronement psalms about the kings. Some of them are wisdom psalms. But the number one category, the single most frequent kind of psalm, is called a psalm of lament. And really that's just kind of a fancy word for complaint. The most frequent psalm is the psalmist complaining to God. And God apparently is not put off by this at all. God allows people to do this. David gets still enough before God that he gets to the very bottom of his pain and discouragement and failure. He feels it in his gut. Now, many people never have the courage to do this. They just stuff it down real deep. They pretend like everything's okay. They wear a mask. They force smiles. But they avoid the pain that's inside of them, and it doesn't solve anything. There are some people who live with such a chronic sense of pain and discouragement that they just get used to it. Like they just don't even notice it anymore. But it leaks out of them. and it robs them of life, and it drains the life out of the people around them. There's a story about a farmer who has a neighbor who's never impressed by anything. This neighbor is a very discouraging guy, and so the farmer gets the world's greatest hunting dog, and he trains it to do remarkable things just to impress this discouraging neighbor. And he teaches his dog to sniff scents from a mile away, to sit and point for an hour without moving a muscle. And so this farmer invites this neighbor to go hunting. And they go, and this dog does all these remarkable things, but the neighbor doesn't say a word. And finally, they're in a duck blind, and a neighbor shoots a duck, and it lands in the middle of a pond. The farmer sends his dog to go get it. The dog goes out and walks on the water and grabs the duck in his teeth. And he walks on the water back to the duck blind and drops the duck at his master's feet. And the neighbor looks over at the farmer and says, "Your dog can't swim, can he?" And you know people like that, don't you? So do I. And you have a little bit of that in you, and so do I. It's possible for human beings to kind of just slide into a chronic form of subtle discouragement that just doesn't go away. And it sucks the life out of them, and it sucks the life out of the people around them. Now, there's something we need to understand about discouragement, and that is God is never the root of discouragement. He never is. When you have a discouraging spirit or discouraging thoughts, you can know that it's not from God. Now, does God bring painful things into our lives? Yes. Does God allow failure in our lives? Yes. Because pain and failure are good things if they cause us to grow. God brings conviction of sin. He brings repentance from sin. He brings challenge sometimes that scare us. He brings a vision of his holiness that sometimes overwhelms us. But he never brings discouragement. God is not a God of discouragement. And anytime we experience discouragement, we can be sure it's not coming from God. So if you want to find strength in the Lord your God, the first step that you have to take is be real honest about the failure in your life. Be honest about what's causing the discouragement in your life. You have to name it, you have to be open about it, and talk to God about it. Okay, so that's the first thing. Just name it, be open and honest before God. Second thing, if you want to find strength in the Lord your God, it'll involve taking action. Look with me again at this story in this little village of Ziklag. It says in verse 6, "But David found strength in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of, I can't even pronounce that word, why can I say it? Ahimelech. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, 'Bring me the ephod.' Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?' 'Pursue them,' he answered. 'You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue.'" So here's what's going on. David is this warrior, and he wants to go before God, and so he has the ephod brought before him and says, "There's this group that has attacked our village, and while we were away, destroyed our homes, taken our possessions, kidnapped our wives, sons, and daughters, and they will be killed if we don't rescue them. Should we go after them? Should we take action? Or should we just quit and stay here?" And the ephod says, "Duh, go." Now, some of you are wondering, what's an ephod? Do they sell them at Target? Where can I get one of these? Well, there's a lot that we don't know about them, but apparently they were objects that the priest would use as a kind of symbol of God's presence when they were seeking God's will. And the very clear message from God here to David is take action. Don't just sit there. Sometimes people get stuck in chronic discouragement because they don't devote the time or the energy or the focus needed to discover what it is that is actually creating the discouragement in the first place, and then take a step of action to deal with it. They're just waiting for some outside force to take care of something that God is actually calling them to take action on. I'll give you an example, discouragement in relationships. Neil Warren, he's the founder of eHarmony. He's a Christian psychologist. He says, what kills relationships more than anything else is the lack of hope. And because when hope dies, the motivation to change dies, and you just quit trying. And so this is his recommendation. He says, take some area in your relationship where you get discouraged, and if you can just get a 10% improvement in a 12-month period, then there will be a huge difference because you're going to actually begin to regain hope. For instance, he said, many married couples come to him discouraged about their sexual relationship because they have expectation problems. This is what Neil said, Christian psychologist. Many husbands want to have sex in the morning, and many wives want to have sex in June. He said this leads to discouragement. Well, in this area, or in a number of different areas, if there can be a 10% improvement in a couple's relationship in 12 months, they'll regain hope. And once that happens, people begin to believe there's some correlation between the efforts they make and the results they experience. And that's when motivation increases, and that's when they begin to make strides because they have hope. But when they live in discouragement, that's death. Some of you are living in discouragement, and you're just sitting there when God is actually calling you to take action, like God called David and his men. And so here's the challenge for us today. Identify, what is the area of greatest potential discouragement in my life? What is it? Maybe it involves your job or your school. Maybe it involves your financial life. Maybe it's a sin that you struggle with. Maybe it involves a relationship. What is that area for you? And then what can you do to see just a 10% improvement in a 12-month period? And then you just start to do it. Some of us have been living in a chronic helplessness, just waiting for some external force to give us the motivation to change, and God is calling us to act. He's calling us to make a commitment to take an action. And if you do, you'll receive hope, and when you do, you'll start to find the strength of the Lord your God. And so the first step in learning to fail forward is just to be open and honest with God about our failure and about our discouragement. And that takes courage. And the second step is to take action. And that takes making a decision. And then there's a third part about being in the cave that's real important. And this third step needs to be taken, and that is to resist temptation. And I just want you to see something in 1 Samuel 24. There's a real important connection between temptation and the cave. When you're in a dark era of life, when you've experienced failure, when you're in that cave of discouragement, you will be vulnerable. This is just the truth about human beings. You will be vulnerable to any temptation that promises to get you out of the cave or to give you a few moments of relief. You will be uniquely vulnerable in that area. In 1 Samuel 24, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 able young men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. The men said, this is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Like, this is the way out of the cave, David. Here's Saul, and the text is telling us a little bit more about Saul than we really want to know. But the reason we need to know this is because Saul is completely vulnerable at this moment. There's nothing Saul could do. Notice what David's men say to him. Today is the day the Lord was talking about. In other words, God promised you deliverance. Now here it is. Like, Saul is here. You can do away with him. You can kill him. This must be what God wants. God doesn't want you to be unhappy and miserable in this cave. God doesn't want you to be in the wilderness. Saul deserves judgment. This is a clear way out of the cave. This must be God's will. And don't you think that must have been so tempting for David? And then the text says, then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. And then he said to his men in verse 6, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. He's the king of Israel. With these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. It must have been so tempting for David to think, I could get out of this cave now. But it would have been wrong. It would have been a shortcut that ultimately I think would have destroyed David. It certainly would have sent a message to everyone in Israel that the way you become the next king is by killing the old one. And I think it would have destroyed his soul. I want to say something real serious right now. I think some of you are in a cave right now. You're in this discouraging place in your life for whatever reason. You failed at something, and it's just gotten you down. And there's a shortcut to relief that's tempting to you. And I believe some of you are here today. God brought you here today just to hear these words that I'm going to say in these next 60 seconds. Will you submit to God's will? Maybe you feel alone because you're single. You've been single for a long time. Or your marriage is in a cave and there's a relationship that promises intimacy and closeness. And it's so tempting for you to think, this is so available and it would feel so good. And I'm so miserably and alone in this cave and God wants me to be happy. I can rationalize this. But it's a shortcut. It's not God's will for your life. It contradicts God's desire for you. And the question that your future pivots on right now is, will you take the shortcut? Or will you submit to God? Will you say, all right, God, I'm going to spend more time in this cave. As hard as it is, I will not take a shortcut out of here. Maybe you're facing financial temptation, and there's a shortcut that promises quick financial gains, but you know that it would mean compromising your integrity and potentially damaging relationships if you got caught. Will you say, God, I will spend more time in this cave. As difficult as this is, I will not take a shortcut out of here. Maybe it's the temptation to deceive someone. Maybe it's the temptation to just ignore a pattern of behavior that's become very sinful and destructive. Maybe it's a temptation to just quit something when you know God is calling you to endure, and it would just feel so good to quit it. Maybe it's a temptation to keep sin hidden. Some of you are here today just to be asked this question: will you have the courage to not take the shortcut, to not give in to temptation, to stay in the cave, even though it would be so easy to try to get out? Because I'll tell you, a shortcut like that can destroy your soul. It really can. It can give you relief for a moment, but it can destroy your soul. So one of the things David has to do when he's in the cave is to find strength in God by resisting a very difficult temptation. David named his failure. He took action when it was appropriate to take action. He resisted temptation when it had to be resisted. And then the fourth thing that's involved in finding strength in the Lord, and that is hang on to God. Like sometimes you're in a kind of cave where with work and thought and prayer and God's help and bold action and right living, you can get out. But sometimes you're in a cave that no human action can get you out of. There's nothing you can do to fix it. There's nothing you can do to heal it or escape it. In that day, all you can do is just hang on to God. That's how David describes over and over in the Psalms. God, when I cannot get myself out of this, I won't let go of you. I will find my refuge in you. I will trust in you. Hanging on to God means you get yourself so immersed in God's presence and so convinced of his goodness and so devoted to his leadership that you find even in the cave, it's a safe place for you to be. Because God is there with you, just as he was with David. Some of you are in a cave today, and you can't get out of it. Some of you aren't there yet, but you will be. Sooner or later in this life, everyone is. And on that day, sometimes all you can do is just hang on to God and cling to the one piece of good news that matters, which is God understands all about caves. Because God was in a cave. Jesus suffered like us, and he suffered for us. The Son of David, as Jesus is referred to in the New Testament, also had everything stripped away from him. He lost his position as a teacher. He lost his safety. His friends ran away from him. He lost the adoration of a cheering crowd. He had his life threatened by his enemies. He went to a cross and he died. And then his body was put in a cave. And they thought it was finished. But they didn't know what the evil one always forgets is that God does some of his best work in caves. Caves are where God resurrects dead stuff. And 3 days later, they couldn't keep him in the cave. You know, I don't know about your cave. I don't know if it's now or if it's coming in the future. I don't know how scary it's going to be for you. But I know God does some of his best work in the cave. So I hope you find strength in the Lord your God. All right, let's pray as the band comes to lead us in a closing song. God, I just want to thank you for the times in our lives where we are in pain and failure and we get discouraged. We're in that cave. And I thank you for it because those are the times when you mold us and shape us like no other time in our lives. God, I pray that those of us who are in a cave right now, that we would just trust you, that we would hang on to you, that we would not try to take a shortcut out, not give in to that temptation, but that we would realize you have us here for a reason. God, help us to take action. Don't let us just sit and wait for some miracle to happen to get us out, but help us to take action. Help us to pray. Help us to think about what you're doing in our lives and to have this kind of perspective that you're at work. And God, I pray that you will bring us through, that you'll get us to the other place where we're out of the cave and we can look back and we can see all that you've done and all that you've prepared us for. Help us to have that kind of perspective. God, thank you that you don't leave us. You don't forsake us. There's nowhere we can go to escape from your presence. You're with us. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for taking care of us and shaping us and guiding us. Even in the midst of our brokenness, in a healthy way, God, I believe we can say, God, thank you. Thank you for being our God. Thank you for your wisdom. That's foolishness to this world. God, thank you that you know what's best for us. God, would you finish your work that you've begun in us? And I ask it in Jesus' name.